Little Gift Shop of Horrors, the 6th episode of the 2nd season of Gravity Falls. And another episode that, seeing the title, I was a little worried about, because I really hate Little Shop of Horrors. Like, if you really like it, that's great. You're a better person than I am. I don't. I get that there are versions of it that aren't the movie, but I watched the movie several years ago, and I disliked everything about it. Again, nothing against you if you really like it, it's not my thing. And so I was kind of half worried that this episode was just going to be a bunch of references to that. Thankfully, though, it was just another questionably canon anthology episode like we got last season, and of course I love those, so I loved this. And I'm going to be handling this review much like I did that review, that being my Bottomless Pit review, which I will link to at the end of this video in case you guys are interested in watching that too, by splitting it up into 3 micro reviews, starting with... First off, I want to talk about the framing device in this one and how much I adored it. It's all told from Stan's perspective to you, the viewer. The camera itself moves about like a person, inserting the viewer into the scenes themselves. And these 3 stories are stories told by Stan to the viewer in an attempt to incentivize them to buy something from the Mystery Shack, which is absolutely brilliant, and I'm mentioning it in the first of these 3 micro reviews because from a plot perspective, it's this first story that is the most simple. Stan steals a watch from a witch, she curses him to lose his hands, slapstick ensues in which he tries to live without his hands. He even gets Mabel to create him some makeshift hands out of, it looked like paper cups and forks, I couldn't really tell for sure. But eventually he admits that he has to return the watch to the witch and try to get her to give him back his hands. They go to her cave, which is just a dank, ugly cave filled with the disembodied hands of other people she's cursed. And they get her to give the hands back by, of all things, helping her to remodel her cave so that it's more inviting so that she might find a boyfriend. And it actually seems to work. A guy shows up at the very end who seems like he might actually be receptive to her advances. This one was very funny, it was very absurd and very amusing. I really enjoyed it. But I would say it is probably my least favorite of these 3. Which brings us into the second of the short stories. Dipper is trying to solve a logic puzzle. It's kind of like a round Rubik's Cube that's supposed to turn into a, crap, I don't even remember what he called it, but like a much more complex shape than just a sphere. When he is not able to solve it immediately, Mabel suggests that maybe he's just not smart enough, so of course, being Dipper, he runs out to find a mushroom that's featured in journal number 3 that you're supposed to be able to grind up and leave on your forehead overnight to make you smarter, but as he is sleeping, Waddles comes up and eats the rest of the mushroom and then eats the mushroom off of Dipper's head. And come the next morning, Waddles is incredibly intelligent, even more intelligent than most humans. And was that really Neil deGrasse Tyson as the voice of Super Smart Waddles, or was that just somebody doing a really good impression of him? Because either way, bravo, Gravity Falls. Bravo. That was excellent. Waddles now has more in common with Dipper than he does with Mabel, which is a bit of a commentary on Mabel. And so the 2 of them go out and start inventing things together that are helping people up to creating an invention which will enhance Waddles' intelligence even further so that he can help everyone. But Mabel misses her friends, so she reminds him of the relationship that they used to have. He dumbs himself back down using the same machine, becomes a regular pig again. The machine breaks, the status quo goes back to normal. End of story, and I actually really like this one. I have some interesting things to say about it, but I really did like this one. It was my favorite of the 3. Which brings me to the 3rd of the short stories, which was basically just a solid several minutes of them poking fun at old style animation, old claymation style animation, the stop motion kind of animation that you would see in older movies like Clash of the Titans, which is actually parodied in the episode pretty heavily. And as a huge animation and special effects enthusiast, I really appreciated this episode. Like, the characters were written to poke fun at some of those old styles of animation, and yet the old stop motion claymation style of animation was lovingly recreated for this episode, and we'll get to that in a second. The plot here is that Stan shows Dipper and Mabel a parody of Clash of the Titans. Not realizing that Mabel is deathly afraid of claymation-style stop-motion animation, she gets all scared and hides, and to try to alleviate her fears after realizing that the movie was actually shot in Gravity Falls somehow, Stan, Dipper, and Seuss take Mabel to the home of the guy who did all the special effects for the movie, so that she can see that they're just little figurines and there's nothing to be scared of. But in typical Gravity Falls style, they're not tiny figurines. They're actually giant scale models made out of clay and animated with black magic. And when the era of stop-motion animation, and therefore the era of their relevance, ended, they captured their creator and enslaved him. And now they plan to turn the main cast members into clay for some reason. And it's actually Mabel who saves the day. She overcomes her fear and reshapes the largest of the clay creatures into a giant star thing from some cutesy kids show that she was watching earlier in the episode, and defeats the other clay creatures, and they are able to escape. And this particular story ends, but not before we get a reference to Gumby, of all things, which was also greatly appreciated. This one was tons of fun, but it didn't have as much substance as I feel like the second of the 3 stories did, which again, I'll talk about that in a minute. But as I said, I am someone who really appreciates special effects and animation, including this older style of special effects animation. I love claymation. It's one of my favorite animation styles. And so seeing that there was some serious, legit claymation in this, like those were real claymation models superimposed into the animated scenes. There's no way that they weren't. But what I found more interesting is that they got someone to animate these. They had to have gotten a claymation studio to do this. And whatever studio they got to do this, they had the attention to detail to actually create these clay characters in the animation style of Gravity Falls, which was fantastic. Again, I don't think this was the best of the 3. I think it was probably the second best of the 3. But I definitely really like it for entirely geeky reasons. So let's talk about this episode overall. I really like the framing device. I already talked about how much I enjoyed that. It really helped me to feel immersed in the story. And I thought it was funny how at the end Stan actually kidnaps you and puts you on display in the Mystery Shack, which leads to a very funny scene in the closing credits. And that probably would annoy me because Stan wouldn't do that, except that this episode was even more cheekily non-canon than the previous anthology episode was. I want to draw the comparison once again to the Futurama episodes that did the same thing. As those went on, even the framing device part of the episode began to feel less and less canon, just like this. However, as someone who is very, very consumed by what is canon and what is not canon, and furthering the canon, and a show should always further the canon, as I've talked about many, many times in my reviews of not just this, but other shows too. I bet you guys are wondering why I'm not complaining about the fact that this episode doesn't really contribute anything to the series overall. And that's because it does. The episode itself may be questionably canon, and the short stories themselves were definitely non-canon. But Stan, for the majority of this episode, was written in character, and he did make up these stories. So how Stan had Dipper and Mabel behave in those stories is a very interesting insight into how the writers interpret Stan interpreting Dipper and Mabel as people. Specifically Mabel. There was a lot of insight into how Stan views Mabel in this episode. In the first story, we see Dipper fighting off the disembodied hands, and his fighting style seems very much like Stan's fighting style was in Scarioki was the name of the episode, which feels very much in line with how he spoke about Dipper in the sequence in his memories where he talks about how Dipper reminds him of himself, and Dipper getting so immediately frustrated with that logic puzzle and trying to find an easier solution could be a commentary on some aspect of Stan's character as well, for the same reason, because he does see himself in Dipper. But look at the kind of stuff that Stan had Mabel do in these stories. In the first and the third story, you see Mabel creating things. She creates the makeshift hands for Stan. She takes charge of the home makeover for the witch. She remolds the Cyclops claymation figure into the giant star creature. So Stan sees Mabel as being a creative person, and I would agree with that. She does seem like a very creative person. But look at the second story, where Mabel was so desperate to get her friend back that she took active steps to prevent him from helping all of mankind. And in the third story, after she creates the star creature, where she is directing it like a general and she seems a little power mad. That tells me that Stan sees Mabel as a selfish and power-hungry person underneath all the cutesiness and the creativity, which I would also agree is entirely in line with her characterization. A lot of you guys have been saying in the comments that even though it seems like Mabel is starting to learn from her mistakes, that she really hasn't yet. And I'm starting to get the feeling that that's entirely intentional, that the writers made the very intentional choice to write Mabel as this very flawed character who doesn't really learn from her mistakes very well. And I think they wrote subtle hints into this episode that Stan does see that in her person. Overall, I like this episode just as much as the last anthology episode, maybe even a little bit more. It was, just like the previous anthology episode, a great opportunity to see short-form versions of some of the ideas that these writers came up with and never really did anything more with. It does now kind of seem like they intended to do one of these every single season, so I'm even more bummed that this show didn't get any more seasons, because it means there aren't any more of these episodes. But I am thankful to have gotten this second anthology episode at all, because it was just that much fun. All of that said, as usual, what did you guys think of this episode? If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.